Here's Michael Smerconish.
Yoni Appelbaum is the author of a brand new book. It concerns our mobility crisis, only he doesn't necessarily mean upward mobility. That's related. But rather, it's a geographic mobility issue that he's talking about. The book is titled Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. There is a portion of the book that's been released via The Atlantic. It's in today's newsletter and is right now published at Smerconish.com. Yoni, thanks for being here. Good luck with the manuscript.
Hey, thanks. I'm so glad to be able to talk to you about this.
Let me read aloud. The idea that people should be able to choose their own communities instead of being stuck where they are born is a distinctly American innovation. It is the foundation of the country's prosperity and democracy, and it just may be America's most profound contribution to the world. No society has ever been as mobile as the United States once was. No society has even come close. Wait for this now. In the 19th century, the heyday of American mobility, roughly a third of all Americans changed addresses each year. What? How come?
People moved because it was the best way that they could come up with to change the trajectory of their lives was by changing their locations. They wanted to go someplace and to make something of themselves, and they were restless, unlike people in the old world who often accepted the identities they've been born with, the identities they inherited. Americans had this remarkable idea that they could become who they wanted to be by moving toward opportunity.
So I guess there wasn't much home ownership among the group that we're talking about constantly moving, right? Otherwise, it would have been a bonanza for realtors.
Yeah, so mostly we're talking about renters, but lots of homeowners too. Mortgages were a lot shorter back then, and people were moving because by changing the place where they live, they could change the kinds of jobs that were available to them. They could change the neighborhoods in which they were raising their kids. And I think this is really fun. Americans back then tended to look at houses the way I might look at a car or an iPhone. That if I'd been in one for 2 or 3 years, there was probably a better, newer model on the market with new features, maybe hot and cold running water, gas lighting, right? That there was constant technological innovation and people were moving in order to take advantage of it.
When they were moving, were they staying among their own?
They were shuffling around, and this is one of the reasons that mobility is so important to America. This is a country in which, unlike a old world village where somebody could arrive and 4 generations later still be the outsider, in America, the constant shuffling of the population enabled us to create pluralism, to come up with a new mode of living that accepted people from many different backgrounds living cheek by jowl with each other.
From your reporting and your new manuscript, in the 1960s, about 1 out of every 5 Americans moved in any given year, down from 1 in 3 of the 19th century, but a frenetic rate nonetheless. In 2023, however, only 1 in 13 Americans moved. Why did the trend end? Why did all this mobility come to a close?
You know, we actually had to update this at the last minute because the census gave us that new number. It's a new record, right? It had been 1 in 12 when I wrote the first draft. It had fallen to 1 in 13 before we could even publish. It changed because we gave local communities the tools to exclude outsiders. The most powerful of those tools is zoning, but a bunch of regulatory tools. And then after we gave them the tools to set really strict limits on what could be built within their boundaries, we allowed almost anyone with the time, the resources, the money to file lawsuits to challenge any approvals. And so today there's a distributed veto. Anyone who wants can hold up development, can stop new housing from being built. And that's made it prohibitively expensive for Americans to live where the greatest opportunities are.
Yoni, as I was reading, I was wondering about the political implications of your discussion of the lack of mobility, geographic mobility in comparison to the 19th century. And then I came to this. In 2016, Donald Trump tapped into the anger, frustration, and alienation that these changes had produced among white voters who had moved more than 2 hours from their hometown. Hillary Clinton enjoyed a solid 6-point lead in the vote that year. Those living within a 2-hour drive, though, backed Trump by 9 points, and those who had never left their hometown supported him by a remarkable 26 points. 8 years later, he tapped that support again to recapture the White House. Unravel all of that for us.
Yeah, there is nothing wrong with somebody who wants to stay in their hometown, as long as it's an active choice. But a lot of Americans have lost a sense of agency in their own lives. And when we were moving around, there were two kinds of choices, which were expressions of that individual agency of choice, of taking your destiny into your own hands and deciding what you wanted to make of yourself. One decision was to move and the other was to stay, and they were both decisions. These days, a lot of Americans are where they were born. They have often an inchoate sense that this is not the country that their parents lived in or their grandparents. It doesn't offer them the same opportunities. They're frustrated that their lives are not going down the path that they had hoped. They may or may not tie it directly to mobility, but they have a clear sense that something has gone wrong with the American promise, and that is tightly tied to their inability to decide where they want to live, to decide what kind of jobs they want to pursue. They can't do it because they're priced out of the places that are growing fast. And so all across the country, there are communities filled with people who are embittered, who are angry, who are cynical. And we've got good psychology research on this. If you want to move and you can't, you will grow more cynical. You will grow more suspicious of outsiders. You will see the world as a zero-sum game. And if you are able to move when you want to move, you turn more optimistic, more accepting. You tend to see the pie growing and don't begrudge somebody else getting their slice.
Yoni Appelbaum's new book is called Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Is that what you're describing for us all by design?
I don't think it was by design, and it's actually one of the hopeful things that I found in my research. I think many of the changes that we put in place were well-intentioned. They were intended to preserve the character of communities, to protect the environment, to protect the history. But in aggregate, it's a little bit like littering, right? If you drop a candy wrapper on the sidewalk, it doesn't make a big difference in the world. If everybody's dropping candy wrappers, over time, the damage really, really accumulates. You block one building from going up, doesn't make a big difference. If you block anyone from building almost anything in the places that are growing fast, then it has an enormous impact. But because it's not what people set out to do, if we can call their attention to it, if they can see the aggregate impact of all of those individual decisions, I think we can probably turn it around.
So the basic premise then is one of, for some, it's fine to stay in the community where you were born and raised and be successful. But for many others, there's opportunity loss when you're not able to do what people in this country in the 19th century did.
That's exactly it. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, as late as 1970, 1 out of 5 Americans was moving, right? So this was how we built the American dream. We gave people the chance to say, hey, I'm going to go out to California. I'm going to move from California to Cleveland because there's good jobs in Cleveland. Wherever they were headed toward opportunity. And for a long time, if you were a janitor in Alabama and you wanted to move to San Francisco, yeah, you'd pay more in housing, but you'd earn a lot more as a janitor in San Francisco. Or maybe you'd find a better job that paid even more. These days, if that janitor in Alabama moves to San Francisco, he ends up with less money in his bank account at the end of the month. He's paying so much in rent, so much in cost of living that even though his wages go way up, he can't make up the difference. And when we take that mobility away from people, when we take away the chance that people had in this country that made this country special to chase the dream, we embitter our politics and ruin our economy.
The part of this that interests me the most is the impact on relationships. There's a theme to this program, a theme of mingling, the basic premise being that we've all been shut in and no longer have common experience the way that we used to, the way that our parents and grandparents were joiners. And I would think that if society is constantly moving the way we used to, physically moving, that it would be disruptive for relationships. But you say no. You wrote this: American individualism didn't mean that people were disconnected from one another. It meant they constructed their own individual identity by actively choosing the communities to which they would belong. Expand on that.
That's such a good point you're making, that we really are disconnected from each other today. It's been a 50-year slide in joining and belonging to communities and membership. And it's the same time that mobility has gone way down. We tend to think of mobility as sort of a social asset, dissolving the ties that bind us together. In America, it's more often been a kind of social glue. When you imagine moving to a new town, right? You may go to church that Sunday. You might show up at the PTA meeting. You need to find relationships. You need to find ways to belong in a new place. And you're liberated to some extent. You're not, it doesn't matter what your older brother did. It doesn't matter who your parents were. You get to decide what your identity is going to be. That was a very powerful American thing, the chance to define our own identities by choosing the organizations to which we'll belong. For 200 years, we've been the only country on earth where most people don't grow up to belong to the church into which they were born. Americans have always had this kind of fluidity with their identities. And it's what makes our civic life so vital and vibrant for so long. As we stop moving, we get stuck in a rut. If you have not moved someplace new, you fall into old habits, you settle into familiar relationships. They atrophy over time, and you don't replace them with new ones because you lack the impetus to do that.
It makes intuitive sense to me the way that you explain it. It makes sense to me that would have been the way pre-cell phone, pre-smartphone. I worry that today, if there were that mobility that you ascribe for us to return to, that people are going to get to a new town and they're just going to face down in their computer again.
That's a fair concern, right? And it's also easier with digital communication to maintain the old relationships instead of creating new ones. So yeah, technology has certainly complicated this picture. But when sociologists talk to people who have moved recently, they do find that they're forming new relationships. They do find that they're more engaged with their communities, that there's something about severing habits, right? If you have a habit and you formed it, you tend to stick with it for a long time. Moving is one of those rare inflection points in our lives where we can create new habits instead of sticking to the old ones. And so, yeah, people may just end up staring at their iPhone screens. I don't have a magic wand that'll solve that problem. But we do know that when people move, they are much more likely to engage in the world around them.
Yoni, with a hat tip to David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report, I want to refer you to another data set, and I'm just going to do it in round numbers. But if you go back to the 1980 election, of the roughly 3,000 counties that are in the United States, you would find that maybe 400 of them were landslide counties. That was the Reagan versus Carter election. So only 400 in round number of 3,000 counties were won by 20 or more points. That number has grown exponentially in every presidential election thereafter, to the point where now roughly 80% of counties are landslide counties. David studies this sort of thing, but it's made such an impact on me. And the point is, of the data, I thought that we are self-sorting, that we are spending increasing amounts of time among the like-minded. And based on his data and analysis, I had this idea, thinking about all the stories written about people from California who get fed up with the progressive leadership and they move to Texas. And I have been of this impression that people who have the gift of mobility, because we all just can't uproot our families, that they are doing so for political reasons today. That seems to be in your wheelhouse. Do you have any reaction?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I had the same impression before I researched this book, that we were sorting ourselves out into polarized tribes. And what I found was I had the story exactly backwards. It's the same 50 years when mobility is declining year over year over year that our polarization is going up year over year over year. The less we move, the more polarized we become. And there's a simple causal mechanism. It's deceptively simple. We tend to try to blend in. We're social creatures. When you move into a new community, you will, over the course of time, tend to adopt the views of those who surround you. This is actually a better predictor, a better driver of the political sort than relocation. People who are Democrats and move into Republican communities are likely over time to adopt Republican views. People who are Republicans and move to Democratic cities are likely to become more liberal in their views. When we were constantly churning the population, it meant that you were constantly encountering people who'd grown up with a different set of assumptions, who adhered to a different set of beliefs. You had to live alongside them, and so we became less bitterly polarized, and you also were less likely to blend in because there was no consensus view in your community. As we have sorted this, we've built a self-reinforcing spiral where we don't move as much. We're not exposed to other people moving into our communities as much. The views become more monolithic. The social pressure to adopt them and conform to them becomes greater, and we become more and more polarized.
Okay, so maybe the answer is that we're not moving for political reasons, but there's some osmosis or something that takes place where you're in that community. How about if I say it this way? You just surrender your views to the groupthink around you.
Yeah, or if you want to be a little bit more charitable about it, you're talking to people, and it's hard to hold fast to a set of beliefs in the face of social pressure. It's hard to be the odd one out, and you'll hear lots of good points being made by the other side, and it's easier after some time to just sort of go with that. And we know that this is how people tend to change beliefs, not on the basis of sort of reasoned argumentation. They change beliefs because the people who they love, who they trust, all believe the same thing, and they go along with it.
I have often said that one of the most important things for a child's upbringing, zip code. And Raj Chetty, whose work you may have studied at Harvard, looking at Facebook profiles and zip codes, has done amazing research to show what goes on based on where you were raised. This is a very important paragraph, and I want to read this quickly and have you respond to it. These are your words, Yoni Appelbaum. It is hard to overstate how much is lost when people can no longer choose to move toward opportunity. Social science research suggests that the single most important decision you can make about your children's future is not what you name them, or how you educate them, or what extracurriculars you enroll them in. It's where you raise them. But if Americans cannot afford to move to the places where growing industries and high-paying jobs, or if they can't switch to a neighborhood with safer streets and better schools and instead remain stuck where they are, then their children will see their own prospects decline. Expand on that.
I'm so glad you cited Raj Chetty's research, because it's putting numbers behind what were intuitions. And it shows us very clearly that the neighborhood shapes a child's opportunities. If we can get people moving to places that have abundant opportunities, where they're surrounded by communities with broad supports, those kids are going to thrive. Those kids will do the thing I think we all want our kids to do, which is enjoy a life that's better than the one that we managed to carve for ourselves. There's nothing, as a dad, there's nothing I'd love more than to see my kids exceed me. But I know that most American kids don't have those kinds of opportunities. They don't live in places that provide that. For a long time, parents could move someplace new. We all know this about immigrants who arrive in the United States, that the children of immigrants tend to thrive in America. Well, there's been really good research on why that happens, and there's a simple answer. The children of immigrants thrive in America because 100% of their parents are migrants. All of those immigrant parents moved someplace new. And when they did, they landed in the cities that had jobs at the time they arrived in the United States. If you match them against American parents who moved to the same cities they moved to at the same time they moved there, the kids of the American parents do just as well as the immigrant kids. So that has been the secret to immigrant success in America, is actually that they relocate toward the places that have the greatest opportunity. If we can let native-born American parents move to those same places, their kids can do equally well.
Okay, wipe the slate clean. Imagine we've not even said a word. This is Yoni Appelbaum. The book is called Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. What's the takeaway from your book?
I think the biggest takeaway for your listeners is that if you want to take control of your life, you can move someplace new and start over. And if you want your fellow Americans to live lives full of opportunity, you got to give them that same shot.
Yoni, I'm totally taken with it. Thank you so much for being here, and I wish you all good things with the book.
Thank you so much for talking.
Thank you. I've got to put this together with my David Wasserman thoughts and see if I can sync them. I think that I can sync them. I think that I can make sense of all of it at the same time. Mingling comes from moving. That's for sure. Check out his book, Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity.